Hello, everybody. How are you guys today? Good? Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We are lucky enough to have some history storytellers here, our friends from St. Paul. We have David and Jeannie, and they are taking us back to January of 1890. So if we can imagine that, I don't know if it was a snowy day or not, but we will imagine it and give them a warm welcome as they get started here.
Where's the clicker? Where's the clicker? Two brothers on their way, two brothers on their way, two brothers on their way, one wore blue and one wore gray. One wore blue and one wore gray, as they marched along the way. The fife and drum began to play, all on a beautiful morning. One was gentle, one was kind, one was gentle, one was kind. One came home, one stayed behind. A cannonball don't pay no mind. A cannonball don't pay no mind, if you're gentle or if you're kind. It don't think of the folks behind, all on a beautiful morning. Two girls waiting by the railroad track, two girls waiting by the railroad track, for their darlings to come back. One wore blue and one wore black. One wore blue and one wore black, waiting by the railroad track, for their darlings to come back, all on a beautiful morning, all on a beautiful morning.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So good to be here today. We came in on the train last night from St. Paul, and fortunately the train still comes here. I don't know if you remember when the Civil War started in 1860, there were no trains in Minnesota at all. And so we are so fortunate now that we have trains coming all the way out here to Marshall. So welcome this morning. So we are here today. I was a soldier in the Civil War. This is a picture of my wife and I.
Yeah, that's when he could button up the front of his uniform.
Well, it seems to... My uniform shrunk. I'm not sure what happened. But here we are, my wife and myself. I'm Lawrence Frederickson, and this is my wife, Linnea. I like to call her Lena, so
yeah.
You can call her Lena if you want. We're going to talk about the music of the Civil War today. Actually, I need to go back here a little bit. All right, there we go. Here we are. All right. So we all know that the war started when the South bombarded Fort Sumter. What was it, April 12th, 1861. So how many of you, we have any vets here, any soldiers who served in the war, any vets? Thank you, sir. Thank you. Anybody, other vets? What side were you on, sir, the north or the south? I take it you were from the north. Okay, great. And probably many of you, your lives were impacted by that Civil War, which lasted 4 years and 5 Aprils. So just a little bit about myself. So I was a student actually at Hamlin College. I was studying to be a Methodist pastor, and yes, Hamlin, now it's in St. Paul, but back in the 1860s, it was in Red Wing, and that's where, basically that's where my wife and I grew up, in the city of Red Wing. And there was about 1,000 men that joined the 1st Minnesota Volunteers, and I was one of 1,000 men. We came from all over the river towns for the most part, up and down the Mississippi River. And some of us were farmers. Actually, my parents were Swedish immigrants, came to Vasa, Minnesota, which is right outside of Red Wing. Oh, they came there about 1855, so I was actually born in Sweden. Still have a little bit of an accent every once in a while. And my wife, actually, she was born in Norway, so she's actually Norwegian.
Yeah.
But somehow we get along, I'm not sure how. So 1,000 men, we arrived in Fort Snelling in the spring of 1861. And our Governor Ramsey, had volunteered the very first regiment to serve in the Civil War, and that was us. That's why we're called the 1st Minnesota Regiment. And by the time we came back 4 years later, there's only about 250 of us left. So it was a very, very challenging time. As we arrived at Fort Snelling, we had no uniforms, we had no guns, we had nothing. We actually practiced initially. We marched on the field, we marched with broomsticks. And so we didn't actually get our uniforms until we arrived in Washington, D.C. So here's some of the men from the 1st Minnesota. We were in the 2nd Corps of the Army of the Potomac. And here I am. Because I was a student at Hamlin College, I was mustered in as a 2nd lieutenant. And by the time the war was over, I was actually a captain. So now I am retired. Of course, it's been 25 years since the war ended. And the 1st Minnesota, we fought at Bull Run with honor and distinction, Antietam. We were there at Fredericksburg, which was a horrible, horrible battle. And then we were at Gettysburg. And maybe some of you have heard of what the 1st Minnesota Regiment did at Gettysburg. How many of you have heard the story of the 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg? Okay. Well, it's an amazing story, folks. And I'm so proud and honored to be part of it. So on July 2nd, 1863, we were commanded to charge a group of 1,500 Alabamians coming right through the middle of the Union lines. And so we charged, we had about 262 men, and we experienced 87% casualties in that brief moment. And it was life-changing for us. Our Colonel Koval, who was also from Red Wing, he was our colonel at the time, and he was severely wounded, but he actually survived, he lived, and now he's actually serving in the state legislature. So here we are, we're arriving back in Red Wing. We didn't actually have to serve, we enlisted for a 3-year term. So we did not actually serve throughout to the end of the war. And after our 3-year term, we were asked if we wanted to re-enlist. And actually several of us men did. I didn't re-enlist. My wife, we actually weren't married at that time, but Lena said, no, Lawrence, you are not going to re-enlist. You're not going to go back. About half the men did, though. They actually formed another regiment. So Lena and I were married, and we got married in 1870. And here's our family today. We have 2 children. And so now I am teaching at Augsburg College, which is in Minneapolis. It's actually a Norwegian Lutheran school. And so I'm teaching history there. And so what I've been doing in recent days, since it's 25 years since the war has been over, Lena and I have been going around now. We are part of GAR, the Grand Army of the Potomac. Grand Army of the Republic, I should say. And we travel around telling the story of the Civil War, because even 25 years after, there's a lot of people that really don't know the story, haven't heard it. Maybe they haven't heard the story of what the 1st Minnesota did, or the 2nd Minnesota. There's actually 22,000 men that served from the state of Minnesota during the Civil War. And so there's many men. So here we are. I don't know if you can see me in the back there. I'm in the background. So this was our St. Paul post, the Acker post number 21 of the Grand Army of the Republic. And my wife is actually, she serves in the Women's Auxiliary of the GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, and she's our snare drum player in there. I don't know if you can find her in that picture. So, so what we want to do today is we want to share with you some of the music from the Civil War, because it's really an amazing story. We often don't hear about the music of the Civil War, and probably many of these songs that we're going to be singing today and performing, you will have heard them. Some of them you know. If you know the words, sing along with us. Some of them will just be playing on brass instruments to give you a feel for them. And so it's been 5 years since our Ulysses S. Grant passed away. Our 2 heroes are gone. Abraham Lincoln, our president, and Ulysses S. Grant. And these were the men that saved our Union. These were the men that led us. And now Grant has there's a monument to him in New York City, and veterans from around the nation are flocking there. The most popular site in New York City now is the memorial, is the monument for Ulysses S. Grant. So I hope, how many of you have seen his monument there? It's way in northern Manhattan, so I encourage you to get there and see it. So the music of the Civil War is called the Musical War for good reason. Participation in musical activity prior to the conflict was widespread, and so when the war came, interest in music carried over to become an important component of the war effort. And I'm going to show a slide a little later on, but there was 10,000 songs that were written during the 4 years of the Civil War. 10,000 songs. So that's about 200 songs per week were written. 75% of the over 2,000 regiments had regimental bands. And so there was a lot of, when we were marching, we had bands marching with us. So when I was a soldier, I did not play in the regimental band. After the war, I took up some instruments, and now I play trumpet and an alto horn in the GAR regimental band in St. Paul. So 1 out of 4 soldiers served as musicians. 54,000 men served as musicians during the Civil War. And there are someplace around, maybe 2 million men that served in the Union, and maybe about 1 million men that served in the Confederate. And the Confederate States, they also had regimental armies. They didn't have quite as many. You're probably aware that the South had about 1/3 of the population of the North, so they did not have the resources and did not have as many regimental bands as we did in the North. And there's a wide variety of music. It was really the war was really a melting pot of music, musicians coming from all over the nation, all the way from far out as California, some from Oregon, of course us from Minnesota, from Texas, from Maine, all over, coming, and during those 4 years playing our music and sharing our music. So we got to know musicians, we got to know music from all over our nation. And as a result, it really, I believe, since it's obvious in the last 25 years, it really changed the direction of music in our nation. Suddenly, all this new music was introduced. Suddenly, Northerns were introduced to bluegrass music that they had in the South, Appalachian music. I had never heard that before. So that was fascinating. This is called the Zubar Regiment. I don't know if you've heard of them. So they dressed like Napoleon, like the French North African army, kind of reminiscent of Napoleon. When the Civil War began, Napoleon was really a kind of a hero, a military hero, because of his military exploits. Here's a drum and fife corps. We'll be talking about them. Black string band. Yes, there were black string bands. There was, by the end of the war, by about the middle of the war, there's 180,000 black men that were serving in the Union. And they had regimental bands that went right along with them. Confederate string bands, there they are. And you'll notice that often when you see pictures of the Confederates, they did not have the resources that we had. They did not have the nice uniforms like we had. And so they often were dressed in rags, and usually their officers usually had nice uniforms, but very few of their soldiers did. Confederate regimental brass band. Notice the unusual instruments. Yeah, there's a lot of really unusual instruments. I'm playing a trumpet and I have a cornet here, but this is called an alto horn. Do you have any brass players here? Anybody play brass instrument? Okay, yes. So this is kind of an unusual instrument. This is not a baritone, it's an alto horn, so it's a little bit smaller. So there was a lot, just hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of musical instruments were developed during the Civil War. And so it was pretty amazing. And then we have buglers. I'm going to be playing a couple of bugle calls today. So I'm not a professional brass player. I'll do the best I can to present these songs to you. And for the most part, I'm a guitar player. That's where I've pretty much spent my life. I'll be talking about some of the buglers. There was 40 different bugle calls that buglers had to learn. 40 different bugle calls. Any buglers here? All right, we got one back there. So this is a Civil War era bugle. And I'm not going to be playing this because these are hard to play. This is not as good. I'm going to be using my trumpet when I do some of the bugle calls. But the buglers, for the most part, were young men. They look a little older there, but they're often young men, and there are many soldiers, many musicians, especially in the drum and fife corps, who were 12 years old or younger. So as the Civil War progressed, it stoked the fires of patriotism and musical creativity in the North and the South. And as I already mentioned, 10,000 songs were written during those short, brief 4 years. Can you imagine that? So if it wasn't for that horrible, horrible war, so many men were killed. 600,000 to 1 million men were killed, and I saw so many Minnesotans were killed. If it wasn't for that horrible war, we wouldn't have all this new music now that is part of our nation, and that musicians are continuing to play across our nation, because now there's GAR bands in the North, and there's Confederate bands in the South. Confederate veterans are still playing this music. So the Civil War was a remarkable melting pot of musical talent, energy, and creativity that changed the course of music in America. So why was the music so important in the Civil War? Because the Civil War was a long, drawn-out conflict that was a horrible experience for the average soldier in the Union and the Confederate forces. And so music provided soldiers with comfort and allowed them to escape the tragedy of war, of violence and death, and to reminisce about peaceful times back home with their loved ones. And I think if you talk to most Civil War vets, maybe you agree with me, sir, a Civil War vet here, the sounds that go through our mind, most of all, not only the battle, but we try to get the sounds of the battle out of our minds and out of our hearts by remembering the music. The music is resonating in the hearts and the minds of Civil War veterans. So music told the story of the war. Sometimes it was actually propaganda. Some of the songs we're going to play today, I think you'd have to say they're pretty much propaganda from the top. They really didn't represent the sentiments of the soldiers necessarily. And so we're also going to play songs that the soldiers would have written and that help the soldiers to understand the big picture of why they were fighting. Why in the world were they dying in this war? And the music really helped tell the story. Music was one of the few sources of entertainment and diversion during the war. And after the war, the music became a part of American culture, as we see 25 years later. It will probably stay with Civil War soldiers for the rest of their lives. And so it was very typical. So the regimental bands, they were, for the most part, they were more professional musicians. They might have been music teachers in high schools or even professional musicians. So they were really different than the drum and fife corps. And so they provided entertainment very often at night. They played for our chapel services, and actually there was many revival services during the Civil War. They played for funerals. They played at night when we were going to sleep. And so music filled the camp. Music was a healing balm to the hearts of many soldiers, and it helped them to express their feelings and to cope with the mind-numbing pain of death, violence, destruction, and disease that they experienced every day during the Civil War, especially in the midst of battle. So, briefly, what caused the Civil War? Well, unresolved issues about slavery in the U.S. Constitution, the Nebraska-Kansas Act, which the Southerners wanted to expand slavery into these territories, and that's basically what Abraham Lincoln said in his debates. He said, nope, we're not going to expand slavery into the West. And then there was the horrible decision by the Supreme Court, the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision, which said no person of color can be an American citizen. Well, there was actually 500,000 black men that were citizens in 1857 when that came out by George Taney. George Taney was actually a Southerner, and he was actually a slaveholder. And really, in many ways, this is hard for us to remember now in 1890, but in many ways, the South really controlled our U.S. government prior to the Civil War. 12 of our first 18 U.S. presidents were slave owners. 3 or 4 of our first 5 Supreme Court Chief Justices were slave owners. And so the slave interests, they really controlled our nation. And then there was John Brown's raid on the U.S. arsenal. I'm sure you've all heard about John Brown. Many in the South considered him basically a domestic terrorist, but he invaded Harper's Ferry in 1859. He gathered a group of 30, 40 men, several of his sons from Missouri. And his plan, as crazy as it seems now, was to take over the U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry. And then his plan was to call upon all the slaves of the South, and there was 4 million slaves of the South in 1860 when the war began. So he thought he could call upon the slaves, and he thought thousands would rush to him at Harper's Ferry, take up arms, and march on the South. Well, that didn't happen, did it? He really was a spark that started the fire, but he was arrested. Actually, he was arrested by Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was the one that, he was a captain at the time. He went and he captured John Brown and his troops there. It was only about 20, 30 men. And so he was hung as an insurrectionist. So John Brown became a martyr and hero in the North, especially amongst abolitionists, and the spark that helped light the flames of the Civil War. So we're going to sing this song. And then we're actually going to sing 2 songs. The song by Julia Ward Howe, the song The Battle Hymn of the Republic. So the song about John Brown was first written. It was actually an Irish tune that was very common. Somebody put the words to it. We're going to sing that here. But then Julia, what was her name again?
Julia Ward Howe.
She wrote the words to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. So I wanted to give you that little background before we now start singing some music and sharing some music with you. And folks, let me just say, if you have any questions, any questions before we continue on with some music now. I speak often across Minnesota in many different settings, and I always invite people to ask their questions right up front instead of waiting till the end. So we're going to sing a couple songs here. Here we go. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. Sing with us. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His soul is marching on. Let's sing a verse of the Battle of the Republic. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Sing, glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. Thank you. Well, that was really became the anthem of the Civil War. And it's still being sung today in churches. And I think you probably can understand, folks. So the Battle Hymn of the Republic, well, Southerners hate that song. And if you go down south, you will not hear that song sung. Are we doing okay with this microphone? Is it kind of going in and out? Can you hear okay? All right. So we're going to do a couple of songs, brass songs. There was the words to that song. So Lincoln was elected as the 16th president of the United States. There's actually 4 candidates that ran in 1860, and Lincoln actually wasn't even on the ballot in the South. He wasn't on the ballot, and actually the Democrats were split into 2 groups, Northern Democrats and a Southern Democrat. So as a result, even though Lincoln won less than 40% of the vote, he was able to win the Electoral College and became our 16th president. And as he was being inaugurated, our Capitol dome was still being built. That's what it looked like. And by the time he was inaugurated, 7 states had seceded, starting with South Carolina in December. And Lincoln got up and he gave his inauguration address. Were any of you there on that day? Okay. I wasn't there either. I was still in Minnesota. I thought maybe there might be some. But he made it very clear. He said, "My Southern friends, it's up to you. If you want to start this war, it's up to you. We are not going to start the war." And Lincoln really knew as a very good lawyer that he had no constitutional reason for starting the war or keeping the South in. And so he drew a line in the sand, and guess what? They stepped over it. And they started the war. So this is what happened. Eventually there was 23 states in the Union. These states out here, Minnesota became a state in 1958. It's the 32nd state. There's 11 states in the Confederacy, 4 border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware were slave states. And West Virginia was actually a part of Virginia when the war began, but because they were in the Appalachian Mountains and did not have slaves, they seceded from Virginia and formed another state. They became a state in 1863. So of course I already showed you this slide. The South, they began the war. And maybe you've heard in recent days, the Southerners like to call it the War of Northern Aggression. Ever heard that phrase? Well, it was really the War of Southern Aggression because the only way that Lincoln could start that war, and he saw at that point that this would be an opportunity maybe to eliminate slavery, but it was because they started the war. So the North fought the war to preserve the Union. The South fought the war to preserve states' rights and their constitutional right to enslave people. And they had that right. It was written into our Constitution, unfortunately. And when our founding fathers, when they created our nation, when they met in 1787 in Philadelphia, the Constitutional Convention, half of the people were slave owners. George Washington was a slave owner. Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. James Madison was a slave owner. George Mason was a slave owner. And so the only way they could form our nation in 1887 and through the Constitution was by allowing slavery to continue. And really, they kind of put the question off. They said, let's talk about it 20 years down the line. Well, throughout the entire early 1800s, they had the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Compromise of 1854. So it was the South constantly pushing, wanting to expand slavery and wanting to keep slavery. Well, it finally came down to the horrible war that we had, the Civil War, and all those men that had to die. Lasted 4 years, 5 Aprils. Here's the war began. The first battle was the Battle of Bull Run in July 21st, 1861. And both sides were very confident that they could win. Well, you probably know and heard that the Northern troops, the Union troops on that first battle, they were routed by the Southern troops. And it just so happens that's when General Jackson showed up right in the middle of that first battle. And that's where he got his name, which he became famous for, Stonewall Jackson. One of the Confederate generals said, "There is General Jackson standing on a hill in the Bull Run battlefield like a stone wall, gathering all of our troops to him for the attack on the Union lines." And that's what they did. Our Union troops fled in disarray. And I can say with great honor and respect to our 1st Minnesotan, we were there in that battle, and we did not run. We were actually there facing, the 1st Minnesota Regiment was actually there, one of the regiments facing Stonewall Jackson, and we did not run in that battle, which many of our soldiers did. And it's easy to understand. It's very easy to understand when you're a soldier, when people skedaddle in the middle of a battle. So after the disaster, General George McClellan, at the age of 34, was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and it took about a whole year for him to train the forces. George McClellan was a really good administrator, but he was not a good battle commander. He did not know how to lead troops into battle. He was really good, well, you could say he was a pencil pusher and a really good at organizing the troops, and that's what he did. And so the troops went into camp, and they marched and they drilled for almost an entire year before they went back out into the field. And one soldier described how they spent most of their waking hours during the war preparing. Drilled in the afternoon, inspection of arms, commenced drilling, drill as usual, morning and afternoon, drilled some more and inspected our arms, quarters, etc. So yes, it was incredibly boring, and it was a lot of work drilling. So we were there, the 1st Minnesota, we were in the Army of the Potomac, and there's many other regiments from Minnesota that were in different armies. Some were with Grant's army out on the western frontier of the battle. Drill, 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 march, march, march. The musicians were all learning their role also during this time. And so we were drilling, and the regimental bands were learning their songs and their music, and the drum and the fife and drum bands were learning their music. The buglers were learning their 40 different songs, bugle songs, that they had to have down for the different commands on the battlefield. So even though it was very frustrating for our president, he was very frustrated with McClellan because McClellan just sat there on the Army for almost a year training them. Lincoln finally wrote a letter to McClellan. He said, "My dear McClellan," apparently Lincoln had kind of a high voice, "if you don't want to use the Army, I would like to borrow it for a while. Yours, Abraham Lincoln." Well, we're going to sing there's a song called All Quiet on the Potomac. And it's very common, the songs that we're going to share with you today. We got about 18 songs we're going to share. It's very common that some of the songs were very popular in the South and the North. So this is one of the songs that both the South and the North adopted, and the regimental bands on both sides adopted. And the way the song was written is because every day while McClellan was sitting with his army of 100,000 men along the Potomac training, the newspapers said every day it was all quiet along the Potomac. That was the message. So we won't sing the words here, but we're going to just play it for you.
Yeah, just play it.
And Lena's going to play her drums.
No, I'm going to play my... Am I going to play my drums? Okay, I am.
Yeah, you can play the drums on this one here. Quiet along the Potomac. And then we're going to do the battle cry of freedom. So this is probably an example of a song that was came from the top down. This was not a soldier's song, and we're going to see that often. This was written by George Root in 1862, and he wrote several versions of it, a rallying version, a battle version. So we're going to play one version, and Lena here is on the snare drum. And so George Root, he was a very well-known writer, musician that wrote many songs during the Civil War. And again, most of his songs are not from the perspective of a soldier. So we're going to see today the songs that really from what a soldier experienced, and these kind of giving a bigger, maybe, like we can call it propaganda from the top down. And that's what this song is all about. And I'll put the words up there for you. Having a hard time seeing this music with my glasses. Oh man, I am sorry, I cannot see. It's a little bit too dark in here.
Should we open up the...
I can't see. Here we go, we'll keep going here. Yeah, I need that light. I was unable to see. Good excuse, huh? All right, well, the Southerners, it was very common when they, and remember these bands, it was often very common, the Union forces might be on one side of the Potomac, for instance, or the Rappahannock or other rivers, and the Confederate forces were on the southern side. And so we would talk back and forth, and there were stories of Union troops and Confederate troops actually meeting in the middle, and maybe sharing some tobacco or sharing some whiskey. But it was very common to share songs. We shared our songs with the South, and they shared their songs with us. Actually, it was more the South taking our songs than us taking their songs. And so they liked this song so much, they took it and wrote their own words for it. A little bit different, Battle Cry of Freedom, the Southern version. And so on any given day at night in camp, you might hear the Southerners playing and singing that song in their camp, and the Union troops singing. And oftentimes we were so close to one another, you could hear the bands playing. So propaganda songs I mentioned which told the story of the war from the unrealistic, and often falsely heroic perspective of the Union and Confederacy leadership, an attempt to motivate the soldiers to fight. Yeah, it was good music, but I mean, the soldiers, sometimes the sentiment that was expressed in those songs, we were kind of like, yeah, right, that's not what we're really experiencing as battle soldiers. And then there were soldier songs, which we'll sing some, which were often brutally honest and told the story of the war from the perspective of those experiencing firsthand the violence and horror and pain of war.